We've always been told the Roman war machine was invincible. The disciplined legions, the superior tactics, the empire that conquered the known world through military genius and iron will. But the treacherous peaks of the Alps tell a much darker story. New archaeological evidence from high-altitude excavations reveals something history tried to bury: Roman soldiers freezing to death before they ever saw combat. Entire centuries wiped out by avalanches. Legionaries hallucinating from oxygen deprivation, stumbling off cliffs in confusion. This isn't the glorious Roman military history we learned. This is the reconstructed truth of the legion that nature almost destroyed. Welcome to the Great St. Bernard Pass, where Rome's greatest enemy wasn't an army. It was the mountain itself, 8,000 feet above sea level. The Great St. Bernard Pass cuts through the Alps between modern Switzerland and Italy. Today, it's a scenic mountain route. Tourists drive through, snap photos, marvel at the views. But dig beneath the snow, and you find something else. Something that tells a very different story about Roman expansion into northern Europe. Skeletal remains, rusted gladi, fragmented armor, nails from military sandals scattered across frozen slopes. The physical evidence of Roman soldiers who died not in glorious battle, but from cold, exhaustion, and the brutal physics of high-altitude warfare. Recent archaeological discoveries in the Alps have revolutionized our understanding of ancient military logistics. These aren't battle sites, they're disaster zones. Frozen snapshots of what happens when a Mediterranean army confronts Alpine survival. The Roman Empire didn't just march through the Alps on its way to conquer Gaul and Germania. It bled there. It suffered catastrophic losses that ancient historians barely mentioned, because they didn't fit the narrative of Roman military invincibility. But why? Why would Roman commanders order their legions into these killing grounds? Strategy, desperation, the mathematics of empire. The Alpine passes were the fastest routes between Italy and the wealthy territories of Gaul. Control these mountain corridors, and you control trade, troop movement. Alps Guard, weeks where enemies can prepare, where rebellions can spread, where the empire's response time becomes a fatal weakness. So Rome had no choice. The legions had to cross the Alps, even if the mountains killed more soldiers than any barbarian army ever would. The Great St. Bernard Pass became a graveyard not because of tactical failure, but because ancient Rome attempted something that pushed human physiology to its absolute limits. Consider what a Roman legionary carried: 60 to 90 pounds of equipment, chainmail armor, helmet, shield, gladius and pilum, entrenching tools, cooking gear, 3 days of rations, personal belongings. This load was designed for Mediterranean terrain: flat roads, coastal plains, river valleys. Now imagine carrying it up an 8,000-foot mountain pass, through waist-deep snow, on paths barely wide enough for single-file march, in temperatures well below freezing. The physiological math is brutal. At sea level, the human body needs roughly 2,000 calories per day at rest. Marching with heavy equipment increases that to 4,000 to 5,000 calories. But at 8,000 feet, with severe cold demanding additional energy for body heat, while climbing steep grades, Roman soldiers in the Alps needed 6,000 to 8,000 calories per day just to maintain basic function. And they weren't getting them. Standard Roman military rations grain, salt pork, olive oil provided maybe 3,000 calories if soldiers were lucky. Supply lines in the mountains were nightmares. Pack animals struggled with the altitude and narrow paths. Every additional day in the pass meant deeper caloric deficit. Soldiers were literally starving while marching, burning muscle mass, weakening with every step. But malnutrition was just one enemy. Roman military equipment was spectacularly unsuited for Alpine warfare. The famous Calici military sandals with hobnails were excellent on roads. They gripped stone. They were durable. On ice, catastrophic. Hobnails that provided traction on Roman roads became skating. Blades on frozen mountain passes. Soldiers couldn't maintain footing. Frostbite attacked exposed toes. Men slipped, fell, sometimes taking entire sections of the column with them down cliff faces. Recent archaeological analysis of skeletal remains from high-altitude sites shows extreme trauma patterns, not from combat, from falls, from hypothermia, from exposure. One excavation near the Great St. Bernard Pass uncovered mass graves containing dozens of Roman soldiers with identical skeletal trauma, broken bones from falls, signs of severe frostbite, evidence of malnutrition. They died before any battle. They died climbing. And then there's the equipment that wasn't personal. Siege engines, ballista, heavy artillery that Roman military tactics depended on. Try hauling a Teuton ballista up a 45-degree slope on a path 3 feet wide. With a 1,000-foot drop on one side, the logistical challenge becomes clear. Rome's greatest military advantage is heavy armor, sophisticated siege equipment. Disciplined formations all became liabilities in the Alps. The mountains stripped away everything that made the Roman legions dominant. What remained were exhausted, freezing men in metal armor that conducted cold directly to their bodies, trying to survive long enough to reach the other side. But even if soldiers survived the climb, even if they maintained discipline and kept formation, another threat waited: avalanches. The Roman military had no concept of avalanche risk, no understanding of snow physics, no way to predict when an entire mountainside would suddenly release and bury a century of soldiers in seconds. Ancient historians mention these incidents briefly, almost dismissively. The march was delayed by falling snow. Modern excavations tell the real story. Burial sites where dozens of Roman soldiers were found together, entombed in what had been avalanche debris, clustered so tightly it's clear they had no warning, no time to scatter, just instant burial under tons of snow and ice. And if the avalanches didn't kill them, the altitude itself became a psychological weapon. Hypoxia-oxygen deprivation sets in above 7,000 feet. Roman soldiers, mostly from Mediterranean sea-level regions, had never experienced it, didn't understand what was happening when their thinking became confused, when exhaustion turned into stupor, when the world started to shimmer and distort. Recent forensic analysis of remains shows evidence consistent with altitude sickness, fluid accumulation in lungs, signs of pulmonary edema. What Roman accounts might call weakness or cowardice was actually soldiers literally drowning. in their own lung fluid as their bodies failed to adapt to thin air. Combine hypoxia with extreme cold and exhaustion, and you get hallucinations, confusion. Soldiers wandering away from columns, convinced they saw shelter or heard voices, found frozen days later, miles off the pass, having walked themselves to death while disoriented. The Great St. Bernard Pass wasn't just difficult, it was actively hostile to human survival. Every aspect of the environment conspired against Roman military effectiveness. And yet, they kept trying. Because the alternative abandoning the Alpine route meant losing strategic control of northern Europe. So how did any legions survive? Adaptation, innovation, and the grim mathematics of acceptable losses. Archaeological evidence shows Romans built high-altitude fortifications at strategic points along mountain passes, not permanent structures, temporary installations designed for overnight survival. These weren't typical Roman forts with proper walls and barracks. They were desperate constructions, stone windbreaks, ice shelters, anything that provided minimal protection from wind and snow. Excavations have found fire pits at these sites, evidence of burned timber hauled up from lower elevations, signs that soldiers melted snow for water and tried desperately to maintain body heat through communal fires that consumed precious fuel. Recent discoveries of rusted gladi and armor fragments at summit elevation tell another story. Combat in conditions where the terrain was more lethal than the enemy. Fighting on 45-degree slopes, where maintaining footing was harder than deflecting spears. Where exhaustion made every sword swing an act of will. Where a wound that would be survivable at sea level became fatal because cold and altitude prevented proper healing. The Roman military had to invent entirely new combat tactics for Alpine warfare. Standard formations didn't work on narrow paths. Shield walls became death traps when avalanches hit. Heavy armor that protected against arrows became hypothermia accelerators. Archaeological evidence suggests Romans adapted by using lighter equipment at altitude, employing local guides familiar with mountain warfare, timing crossings for summer months when passes were most navigable, and accepting catastrophic casualty rates as the cost of strategic mobility. Recent excavations near the summit of the Great St. Bernard Pass uncovered something particularly haunting. A cluster of rusted gladi, driven point first into rock, arranged in a pattern suggesting a memorial or marker. These weren't dropped. They were placed deliberately, possibly marking where soldiers made final stands not against human enemies, but against nature itself. The iron was still there 2,000 years later because the cold preserved it. A frozen monument to legionaries who died doing what Rome demanded, marching forward regardless of cost. The Roman experience in the Alps forced military innovation that echoed through centuries. After suffering devastating high-altitude losses, Roman military logistics evolved. Winter gear improved. Supply chain planning became more sophisticated. Routes were mapped with attention to seasonal conditions. The lessons learned from these Alpine disasters informed Roman northern campaigns. For the next 300 years, every Germanic campaign, every winter operation, every mountain crossing, modern military historians studying ancient Rome now recognize these Alpine operations as crucial turning points, not glorious victories, but survival challenges that forced the world's greatest military machine to adapt or fail. Today's elite Alpine military units, Swiss mountain troops, Italian Alpine, US mountain warfare school, all study historical Alpine campaigns. The Roman experiences in the Great St. Bernard Pass provide case studies in what not to do, but they also demonstrate something profound about human endurance. Those Roman legionaries knew the mountains were killing them. They saw comrades freeze, watched centuries disappear under avalanches, felt their own bodies failing from altitude and cold, and they kept climbing. Not because they were superhuman, because Rome demanded it, because military discipline overrode survival instinct, because turning back meant desertion, and desertion meant execution. The skeletal remains found in Alpine excavations aren't just archaeological curiosities. They're evidence of what humans will endure when systems demand it, when empire requires sacrifice, when survival means completing the mission even if the mission is suicidal. The Lost Legion isn't one specific unit. It's the collective memory of thousands of Roman soldiers who died in the Alps, whose bodies were buried by snow and ice, who history forgot because their deaths didn't fit the narrative of Roman invincibility. But the mountains remember. The archaeology remembers. The rusted iron driven into frozen rock remembers. And now we remember too. Rome conquered much of the known world. But in the Alps, nature proved that even the greatest empire had limits. That some terrain couldn't be dominated through discipline and tactics alone. The Great St. Bernard Pass stands as a monument to those limits. A frozen reminder that sometimes the greatest enemy isn't an opposing army. Sometimes it's the mountain itself, patient, indifferent, invincible, and no amount of Roman military genius could change that. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and like for more historical stories.